Hello, my name is Jade Shields, and today I will be speaking on Jane Austen and how her life and work fits into modern-day feminist frameworks. First off, I will briefly explain what a feminist framework is for those of you who may not know. A feminist framework in this context is a series of traits presented in a literary work that align with feminist rhetoric or ideology. For example, Raven, a character from DC Comics that I am very fond of, is a female superhero who engages in physical combat with villains and rescues people from harm. This character fits within the feminist framework. So, going forward, I will state and explain the traits that Austen's books display that fit within that framework. I've conducted my research using Austen's works, as well as Jane Austen, A Life by Claire Tomalin, A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, and the Sage Handbook of Rhetorical Studies. I analyzed what the Sage Handbook's guidelines for modern-day feminist frameworks were, and did the same with the Rights of Women, which was, at the time, radical feminist theory. I then took these guidelines and compared them with Austen's life and work. In Chapter 8 of the Sage Handbook of Rhetorical Studies, the author of that chapter, Kate Ronald, describes an anthology of essays that track the evolution of female rhetoric over the course of the Victorian era. One change that came with this evolution were the conceptions of public and private voice. Austen is a good example of this change. Her voice is clearly heard throughout the course of all of her novels, essentially making her public voice and her private voice one and the same. In Chapter 3 of the Sage Handbook, the author of that chapter, Christine Mason Sutherland, states that an important element of feminist rhetoric, as well as rhetoric in general, is the importance of context and the necessity of including both ethos and pathos. This is a principle that is frequently demonstrated by Austen's works, particularly in Sense and Sensibility, a story about two sisters who, through a series of misadventures, ultimately learn the importance of maintaining a balance between sense, which in this case means to act sensibly, or ethos, and sensibility, a synonym for sensitivity, or pathos. When analyzing Austen according to the framework described in The Rights of Women, the first result I found was that Austen emphasized the importance of personal choice for women, specifically in regards to marriage. In Austen's time, the only way a woman could be independently wealthy was by being an heiress or a widow. Unless you were the former, the only way a woman could become independent from their families was to become dependent on a man, in other words, on a husband. This was especially important because it was also one of the only ways that a woman could be certain that she would be provided for all her life. If, for example, a woman's father died, then she would become dependent on her nearest male relative, an uncle, brother, or cousin. However, if a woman's male relative decided not to provide for her, or if she doesn't have any male relatives at all, then she would have no choice but to fend for herself, which, with limited career opportunities available to women at the time, would be extremely difficult. So, for Austen to encourage the idea of refusing marriage was at the time unthinkable, but she posits the idea that it was not worth it for a woman to be married if that marriage would make her miserable. She demonstrates this idea most famously in Pride and Prejudice, twice. Her protagonist, Elizabeth, first rejects a proposal from Mr. Collins on the grounds that he was a foolish man, and since she could not respect him, she could not marry him. Later in the book, she rejects Mr. Darcy on the same grounds. Since she couldn't respect him, she could never grow to love him, let alone marry him. This was an idea that was also posited by Wollstonecraft in The Rights of Women. She stated that a marriage that was not based on mutual respect would only bring emotional and mental harm upon the couple, as well as any children they may have. Austen herself never married, presumably for that reason, although there has been no proof found of that being the case. The second result was that Austen, through her work, advocated for the benefits of education for women. Not all women were educated beyond reading, writing, basic math, and perhaps an extra skill or two, such as knowing a foreign language or playing an instrument, in order to make them more attractive to potential suitors. The protagonists in Austen's books were all educated and intelligent in various ways. Fanny, from Austen's book Mansfield Park, though underrated by most of her family, is highly intelligent and well read, with a particular taste for poetry, which she often quotes in the novel. This is another trait that was reflected in Austen's own life, as she came from a family of voracious readers and was encouraged to pursue education for the sake of it all her life. This is also another point that is strongly advocated by Wollstonecraft in her book. She stated that in order for women to be on equal footing with men, they must be given the same basic education as men, as well as the same opportunities to further their education should they desire to do so. I believe these findings are significant because although they may seem like simple common sense today, Austen's work demonstrated radical feminist ideas for that time period. Today, she is most commonly known as a romance writer. However, she didn't just write romance. Her work was a fictional demonstration of early feminist theory.